Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 16th of June, 2021, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by Alex Thompson, bringing us Eastern approaches from the Netherlands.
Well, Joe Biden has arrived in Switzerland. Just 15 or 20 minutes ago, he arrived for the meeting with Vladimir Putin. This is the end of a whistle-stop tour at the G7 and then the NATO summit. It's not surprising, therefore, that it took him an absolute age to get out of the car because he must be knackered. But what are they going to be talking about? Well, who knows? It's the first meeting between the two, and of course, Biden claiming that he's going to undo a lot of the damage done by Trump. He's looking for a stable, predictable relationship with Russia. But he is pretty upset because he's claiming that Putin has been interfering in American elections. They're still banging that sad old drum, that he's provoked wars with people next door to him, and that he's seeking to crush dissent. And of course, that's with reference to Mr. Navalny and so on. It took Biden so long to get out of the car, by the way, they had to cut away to something else and then cut back to him. But there he is. On Putin's part, then, he's obviously upset that the US is supporting Ukraine's government. He's upset that the US is backing the likes of Navalny and also the Belarusian situation, and also NATO in Eastern Europe. So this was what Putin had to say to the US press. However, we have a saying in Russia, don't be mad at the mirror if you're ugly. And Alex, I think that sums the Russian position up pretty well. I'd be interested to see what your thoughts are on who is more correct in taking their position, because the Russians really do have a point with respect to NATO coming up against their borders. Well, NATO's position is, well, Russia's being aggressive. It's a bit pathetic.
It is, Mike, and this does go all the way back to the era when James Baker was US Secretary of State in the George Bush Senior administration, and Shevardnadze was the foreign minister under Gorbachev. And there were gentlemen's agreements at that time, which, people shouldn't laugh that off. Gentlemen's agreements is how great powers form real, generational accords, that NATO would never go east of the Oder-Neisse line, the former border within Germany, let alone subsume Eastern Germany, Poland, and now the Baltic states, and be within a couple of hours' drive of St. Petersburg and Moscow. So this is really a 30-year contention. Shevardnadze and Gorbachev afterwards, although they were globalists themselves, admitted that they had been outsmarted by a senior and more devious class of globalists. And I know it's usually, shall we say, the hard left or the old left that makes this point, but there's nothing preventing just any kind of constitutionalist from making that point. And of course, the big issue with Biden meeting Putin is we know how addled Biden's brains are, and he's going up against a counterpart in Putin who is noted for memorizing apt idioms, one of Russians' many idioms about mirrors and hypocrisy you quoted there. But Putin also memorized statistics, which he'll be able to reel off dates, facts, and figures. I think he'll leave Biden in the dust.
This is absolutely correct, and I just wonder how Biden is going to react to that, how the whole situation is going to be handled. But of course, this meeting is only just begun, so we can't give any kind of readout of it just yet, but we will report on Friday, no doubt.
I was just going to ask Alex, is it fair to say that Biden is like Brezhnev's last days?
This is a point that Putin has been hinting at with his noted comment a couple of weeks ago, picked up by TASS news agency, that the United States is wandering the Soviet Union's path with a swing in its gait. With a confident gait. So he sees the United States heading for its dissolution moment. And of course, the big thing about Brezhnev's final days is that he was kept in aspic the last few years by that very nefarious figure, Andropov, who was head of the KGB. And basically, if you read the works of Christopher Story, the pen name of Edward Hall, Andropov and the KGB were holding Brezhnev hostage and not permitting him either to die or to speak of his own accord for several years. So that possibly is a key to what's happening now with the dead hand of the US spook state manipulating Biden.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Okay, let's come back to the UK then. And this is Edgy Productions, and they produce scripts for plays and so on. Superb musical songs and assemblies for primary schools is how they describe themselves. Well, we've been told of several schools around the country running a school play that's on screen. It's called Wow, What a Year. And this is going to be an end of term for this summer term play based on this script from Edgy Productions. It's for year 6 primary school pupils. And for anybody that's outside the UK, that means 11-year-olds who are just about to go from into some form of secondary education in September. And of course, it's at secondary level education, which is going to be trying to impose vaccination in schools. So what does it say there? It says where to start: homeschooling, empty supermarket shelves, social distancing, bubbles, tears, face masks, not being able to hug your grandparents. These have been extraordinary and challenging times, but through it all, heroes have emerged, and with a strength of spirit, hope in our hearts, and a sense of humour, we're coming out the other side. So what better way to commemorate our place in history than with a bloomin' good sing-song? That's what they say. 10% of the profits from this are going to go to the Captain Tom Foundation. So that's excellent. So let's have a look at what the script is all about. Well, this is the beginning. The teacher and her class reflect on the monumental events that have shaped our lives in recent times. They discuss the pandemic and how various aspects of lockdown have put us all in some quite challenging situations. As we look at snapshots of these situations, we see that amongst the sadness and frustration, there have been moments of hope, heroism, and even humor. And then there's a song, Wow, What a Year. It then goes on to say, the next stage is we celebrate these frontline workers whose amazing efforts provided a lifeline during lockdown. In a cinematic scene, we imagine them as a team of Marvel superheroes assembled to battle the evil foe. With kerpows aplenty, they emerge triumphant, but acknowledge the sacrifices and efforts made by all of us in this epic struggle. And that ends with a song called HERO. Then they consider all the rules and restrictions that they were subject to during lockdown, how confusing they could be, and how they seemed to change from one announcement to the next. We join 3 experts as they prepare to give another COVID briefing to the nation, in which they will outline their latest ideas to flatten the curve. Realizing that perhaps previous instructions had been less than straightforward, they decide to inject some pizzazz into today's briefing, hoping the message will really hit home. And the song in this case is Put That Mask On. The next stage then, however, there is a light at the end of the tunnel with the development and rollout of a vaccine. This has been the cause for celebration, and we take a fly on the wall look at how such celebrations may have taken place amongst the scientists responsible. And the song is A Shot in the Arm. And then finally, so here we are, having lived through our own place in history, we can now look to the future with hope. Things may take a while to get back to normal, but there will soon be possibilities and opportunities to make the most of and enjoy a chance at last to live our lives and be anything and everything we want to be. And the song is called Running Free. So this is what is being pushed to year 6 students, 11-year-olds. They will be making this play in a number of schools that we know of. And we're very keen to find out from people whether this is happening in their schools and your schools as well, because we'd like to know how widely spread this is around the country. Is this just a couple of schools that happen to have picked this up, or is there some central effort to push this out to primary schools right across the country? I'd be very keen to hear.
Yeah, it immediately reminded me, Mike, of a company called Leading Light that was pushing out plays to do with suicide at the time when suicides were the big issue in South Wales, and we followed that through. I would guess there's going to be some centralised control, and I did notice the one eye for the boy in the cartoon picture that accompanied it, if people understand that significance.
But of course, just a couple of days ago, the Telegraph here reporting children may need to get COVID jabs in order to avoid disruption to education in September. This is Chris Whitty making this statement. And a play like that certainly primes primary school pupils that are heading off to secondary school to be complicit in that. But Alex, what's going on from France, Les Echos here?
Les Echos is the French equivalent of the Financial Times. It is the journal that all the movers and shakers in business subscribe to. And here, in the personage of its editor-in-chief, no less, Etienne Lefebvre, they are preaching that it's time to se vacciner pour les autres, to get jabbed for other people. This, of course, being the first time in the history of vaccination that such an idea has been pressed, but now it's mainstream. And if you tap again, you will see some detail of the argument that Mr. Lefebvre is making. He concludes his op-ed by saying that convincing parents in dialogue with the treating doctor that the jab is not dangerous for their child is a tailor-made measure to cover the last mile, the hardest to run. So there is an acknowledgement by the money, in France at least, that it is hardest to persuade parents to get their children jabbed. And this is even before we get on to the questions, of course, of efficacy and safety being open-ended, no long-term safety studies possibly existing yet. And with an eye to that previous piece that we had there about the children's musical in Britain, they sing "Put That Mask On." Is there a single study in the world, even to this day, 2 years into COVID, that pretends or purports to prove that masks have efficacy in stopping the relevant transmission? So I don't know, but Lefebvre is saying we need to go completely over to a propaganda system of telling parents your children need the jab for les autres.
Yes, okay, thank you for that. Now, we'll move on to The Guardian here, because it was The Guardian that was the first to report this. COVID jabs to become mandatory for care home staff in England. So they're saying COVID vaccinations are to become mandatory for care home staff in England under plans to be announced by ministers as they consider extending the move to all NHS staff. The controversial measure sets up a likely battle with staff in both services and could lead to the government being sued under European human rights law or equalities legislation for breaching the freedom of people who work in caring roles to decide what they put into their bodies. The Guardian understands that ministers will confirm they are pushing ahead with compulsory vaccination for most of the 1.5 million people working in social care in England, despite employer and staff organisations in the sector warning that it could backfire if workers quit rather than get immunised. Under the plans, those working with adults will have 16 weeks to get vaccinated or face losing their jobs. Now, we've had quite a lot of communication on this from quite a number of people very concerned that they're going to be put in this position and fearful for their jobs and so on. Now, of course, this is typical behavioural insight and behavioural analytics going on here, because they push these stories out into the mainstream press and then they watch the reaction on social media and other places. So what this article is about, because the decision hasn't been announced yet, I'm quite certain they intend to make this decision, then they intend to announce it. But what's really going on here is that the pre-announcement is to assess the willingness in the population and what kind of pushback they're going to get. So there is still time for people who are unhappy about that situation to make their feelings understood. The first protocol would be your own MP, of course. But it's a pretty draconian direction to be heading in.
Yeah, I'll just add that we do know that there are law firms now looking into what's happening here, and they are warning that some organisations, firms employing people are simply making up the law with regard to forcing their employees to be tested or have vaccinations. And a lawyer I was able to speak to last week said it's very clear that the law still does not allow for this to happen. So I think it's encouraging if we've now got people in the legal profession at least starting to ask the right questions.
Now, The Telegraph has this headline today: hospitals overwhelmed as Delta variant fuels increase in COVID around the world. And they're not talking about British hospitals here, this is internationally. But the narrative from the headline is just to plant that little seed that hospitals are being overwhelmed. And that could very well happen here as well. But the question, we've been talking about the situation with hospitals being overwhelmed as we speak around the UK and certainly around England and Wales, and asking why that's happening. And we've seen a couple of headlines over that. This is from a couple of weeks ago. Fresh questions over 21st of June reopening as NHS boss warns hospitals going at full pelt with non-COVID backlog. Well, that could mean anything. A non-COVID backlog might be operations that haven't been carried out because of the a reorientation of the NHS to COVID and ignoring everybody else, or it could be vaccine adverse reactions because they're non-COVID as well. But if we look at the dashboard from the government website for patients admitted to hospital who have had a positive PCR test, we see that the levels there are still absolutely at the completely low levels. So the question is still, why are the hospitals full? Well, we've been sent this, and thank you very much to the person who sent it through. This is an email that's being sent to every clinical employee, as it was described in the NHS. It's titled Management of COVID-19 Vaccination Clinical Incidents, a briefing for trust clinicians. In light of several recent potential vaccine-related incidents, I'm writing to confirm the actions you should take to ensure patients receive best care and to enable incidents to be monitored and escalated properly. Please see the algorithms for advice. I thought that was quite interesting. But it goes on to talk about significant adverse reactions and reactions to COVID-19 vaccines, which must be reported to DATIX. So that's not yellow card. And then later at the end of the article, it says that clinicians are required to refer the on-call hematologist and to escalate to CARS, which is Clinical Advice and Response Service. And that's not yellow card either. So this is an email that's literally just in the last couple of days been sent around every clinician in the NHS, and there's no mention of when they come against an adverse reaction that should be reported to the yellow card system. I thought that was interesting. But let's have a look and see what DATIX is. First of all, this is incident reporting on DATIX. This is, I think, from Shropshire Hospital Trust. And it tells them what they should report, why they should report an incident, how they should report it. And it's done through an intranet IP address. And so that's one method of reporting. But if we look at this document here, which is the COVID-19 Vaccination Program Standard Operating Procedure, I'm pretty sure we've had this on the program before. But what's interesting is that it is no longer available on the NHS website. This had to be obtained through the Wayback Machine. And this is some of the text of it. They mention the MHRA yellow card system. They then talk about PHE reporting form and NRLS e-form reporting and local risk management system, which is DATIX, but also Ulysses. Also, NRLS should not be solely relied on for reporting. These must also be escalated to RVOC/CARS, which we've just mentioned. And Brian, what struck me about this is it's hardly surprising that the yellow card system is being completely forgotten by clinicians. It's not mentioned in emails that are telling people how to report adverse reactions, but it's completely forgotten by clinicians because they already have about, several different mechanisms for reporting adverse reactions, and they must be spending all their time just filling in forms.
Well, one would have thought so, but I think the reality is they're not even doing that, Mike. But we've got a lot of questions to ask because clearly there's data here which the NHS and these partnering organisations are hoovering up or attempting to hoover up. Where is that data going and what is it being used for? Because it clearly isn't being used for patient safety, because we know that MHRA is not investigating causality between problems and vaccine, what are listed as vaccine adverse effects. So huge amount of data being sucked up. What's it being used for? A lot more work to be done on that, and we're looking at some of those areas.
Yes.
So more to report in the coming days.
Indeed. Now, on Monday's program, we showed a little bit of video of Eric Clapton, another past rock star that has been speaking out is Van Morrison. And well, Van Morrison today has absolutely been hammered in the Independent. Van Morrison is a toxic menace. Glastonbury shouldn't be hosting him. So one of the comments that's made in this article, it says some of this nonsense is served via social media. This is the stuff that Van Morrison's been talking about, but most has been in the form of song lyrics. After a career where the drama of Irish politics seldom featured in his work, Van Morrison now describes his deeply paranoid offerings as protest songs. He even teamed up with fellow COVID skeptic Eric Clapton under the name Kill Me the Rebels. to release dull songs that compare lockdown to historic slavery. For good measure, Van also likes to hint strongly at another ancient conspiracy theory that one song in his latest album called They Own the Media, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I'm not saying that Van Morrison is peddling anti-Semitism, but he also sang in 2005 about how being sold out for a few shekels was the oldest story ever told. Make your own mind up, as conspiracy theorists are often wont to say. So this journalist, if we can call him a journalist, Oliver Keynes, claiming that he's not saying that Van Morrison is anti-Semitic, when in fact that's exactly what he's doing. But it is a massive hit piece on Van Morrison because, of course, he's been releasing songs which have been critical of lockdown and the COVID policy and so on. But the question is, who is the toxic menace here? Is it Van Morrison or is it Oliver Keynes? Well, I'm just going to let you know. This is the journalist here. Ollie Keynes is a disco DJ from London and a resident with Queer Party Collective, Little Gay Brother. So you have a look at his CV and decide for yourselves, just to throw that quote straight back at him, about which of the two is the toxic menace. But the bottom line here, Alex, is that once again, the answer for any kind of criticism or any kind of commentary on the policies that are in place is to cancel people rather than to actually comment on their criticism or engage in a healthy discussion.
You know, the younger viewers and foreign viewers among us might not be fully aware that Van Morrison, well, obviously many people will know that he's a pop music icon from Belfast, but they might not be aware that certainly in the 90s, broadsheet journalism, the serious chat shows on TV would always give a nod and a wink to what cultural icons like Van Morrison were saying. And whether they were left, right, or centre of the political spectrum, serious political commentators and journalists would talk about the rebel tradition. And yet we go forward to the book which we've publicised recently, Laura Dodsworth's new book, State of Fear, the runaway bestseller that covers a lot of UK columns ground about the use of SPIB fear tactics on the population. And when she's speaking to an anonymous scientist in Whitehall, the scientist says these SPIB characters do not like rebels. They like conformity. They wouldn't have liked Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks didn't stand up and get off the bus. And I know this is a peaked comment by an annoyed scientist who sees himself passed over by the new wave of behaviorists, but it does show something very deep tectonically shifting in the British commentariat, that suddenly Van Morrison is yesterday's man. And the subtext is he's from an irritating past generation that didn't know when to shut up and pull their forelocks at government.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's move on to this then. This is the School of Health and Related Research at the University of Sheffield. And they've been taking a look at the use of do not resuscitate orders during the first phase of the lockdown and so on. And so let's just have a look at what they said. We found that 31% of adults admitted to hospital with suspected COVID-19 during the first phase of the pandemic had a do not resuscitate decision recorded on or before their day of attendance, after excluding those who could not be classified. They went on to say most patients, 59.4% with an early do not resuscitate decision, survived to 30 days, and 11.6% received some form of organ support. These findings show that potentially life-saving treatments were provided to a significant proportion of people, potentially addressing concerns that do not resuscitate decisions may be conflated with, quotes, do not provide active treatment. So that seems like a positive statement. But then it goes on to say this, the use of invasive intervention, particularly mechanical ventilation, in people with a do not resuscitate decision was an unexpected finding. So they are quite positive about the fact that people with DNRs placed upon them were receiving some form of medical intervention, but they were surprised to find that mechanical ventilation and invasive intervention of this kind was used when there was a DNR in place. Now, I don't know what to think about that, but certainly many people, many medically trained people that we've spoken to over the past 14 months have said that, you know, the use of mechanical ventilation and the drugs that are involved in enabling that use, because obviously it involves an induced coma, is very, very, it's very challenging. And if somebody has been given a do not resuscitate order, then they must have been in a fairly bad place in the first place. So my question is, what would the effect of putting somebody like that on mechanical ventilation have been?
Yeah.
I
Could it
don't-
shorten their life, possibly?
That's the question.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Okay, Alex, back to you.
The Dutch Health Ministry here, with the acronym on screen being VWS, is in a bit of bother. Even the Dutch equivalent of the BBC, NOS, is reporting that the Dutch Audit Court, or Audit Chamber, but usually called Audit Court in Dutch, has found that it spent 5 billion euros, 5,000 million euros, unlawfully on COVID material. And that's the headline that's on screen. And we can zoom in a bit on the image there and find that the key paragraph is that if you go back to that,
Yeah,
is that
okay.
5.1 billion euros of taxpayers' money has been spent on COVID material such as masks, respirators or ventilators, depending on which part of the English-speaking world you're from, and tests. So at least one of these points is overlapping with what you have just reported. 40% of that material cannot be properly accounted for. The auditors, which is a separate branch of the Dutch government, as often on the continent, have gone through and found that there's no invoices and no delivery receipts at the hospitals or storage centres for much of this material. Now, the next slide gives a little more detail. That was a month ago, and now this has become a hot potato this month, June, in Dutch politics, because NOS, in a follow-up report, has, even though it's a cheerleader for government in most of these matters, has looked at the 25 costliest big-ticket items that the Ministry of Health and Welfare has spent on in the COVID crisis. And you can see on screen the costings, A to E, of the top 5. E and C together are the ones people would think of straight away. These are the 5 most expensive COVID deals. So E, a third of €1 billion for buying vaccines. C, 800 million euros for vaccine implementation. D, in between them, 336 million euros, is making test equipment available to labs. B, at 835 million euros, is performance of contracts with COVID test labs. But the runaway number 1 here, at just shy of 2 billion euros, is spending money on the National Resources Consortium. And the resources meant here are backup resources. And so in many cases, it seems to be, as you can see from the images that were just shown there as well from the press reports, a case of backup equipment, stores of masks and respirators or ventilators that in some cases didn't get to the hospitals, and in some other cases appear not even to have made it as far as the national storage centres. There's very little animus in the Dutch Parliament at the moment to pursue the Dutch minister responsible, Mr. De Jonge, who also, by the way, has been the implementer of Scotland's named person policy in the Netherlands. We've reported on that in the past. But at least one of the rising dissident parties, the same party led by Mr. Baudet that David featured last week, asking other awkward questions, are starting to ask questions about that. And the MP in question is a former civil servant. So watch this space. Several continental countries have had scandals of this kind. In Germany, several national and regional politicians have been caught out investing in mask-producing companies in China just before masks became obligatory.
Yes, so clearly somebody's making lots of money here.
Yes, Alex, I was just going to say, was it just to do with masks and physical equipment, or was this also to do with written material handed out? Because this seems a huge sum if it's simply to do with masks and ventilators, nearly 2 billion euros.
I haven't seen any distinct reporting that public campaigning materials and education is part of it. I will try to follow that up, but the Dutch are very sceptical of such stuff anyway. They're much quicker than the Brits are to cry foul and say, stop indoctrinating us. And they're much more the down-to-earth people that would rather see their taxpayer money go into physical assets. So I have a sneaking suspicion that most, if not all, of this 5 billion that's gone walkies, at least 40% of it's gone walkies in legal terms, is actually on contracts for physical stuff, some of which doesn't appear ever to have been commissioned.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, let's come on to the subject of demonstrations in London. And of course, over recent days, many people have been protesting the lockdowns, particularly outside Downing Street. Things came to a head yesterday when the police made every effort to clear out protesters. And a number of video clips came up on the internet showing what was happening. What was interesting is watching the interaction. Overwhelmingly, the people protesting against lockdown were polite and well behaved. There was some shouting, there was some noise and music, but overwhelmingly these were peaceful protests. But yes, they've been going on for some days, and the police decided they were going to take the effort to clear out the protesters. We watched a number of clips of film showing the demonstrators and the police in action, but this one particularly caught my eye, with one policeman acting in what can only be described as a very strange way. Let's have a look at this clip by Media Consumer 911.
Can you give us a promise?
Sorry, okay. Sorry, Brian, it's that one, yeah.
You come! You're on camera! Come on!
Let him go!
Come on! You're going to be arrested! You're going to what?
Let him go!
You're going to what?
You're not arrested!
Are you on drugs? Right.
You're a prick!
Are you on Class A's? You're chewing a lot. You look dissociated. Why are you chewing so much? Sir, why are you chewing so much? You look dissociated.
You broke his arm! You broke his arm! You broke his
Can I
arm!
stay back, please? Thank you.
You broke his arm! You broke his arm! Are you on your own? You are a loser! You dirty fucking pig! You dirty fucking pig!
Well, I'm going to say that that interaction in general was fairly typical. There were people shouting, there were people challenging the police. The demonstrators were particularly concerned there because one gentleman had been held on the floor. He was being led away at the end of that clip. But it was the behaviour of the bearded policeman who did indeed look as though he wasn't entirely with it. And so the protester was saying, "Are you on drugs?" But there was clearly a problem with that particular policeman. I wonder whether this was pure fear, that the briefing in the base before they came out on the streets was that any member of the public who dared challenge them was a danger and possibly could kill them. Is this the level of fear that's been given to the policeman? But what was wrong with that particular officer, I don't know, but clearly something was. Well, if that was one report, let's come on to the Daily Mail, which really got stuck in because a BBC reporter had come under the same pressure from those present. The BBC reporter had been challenged, so this is Mr. Watt, and the Daily Mail carefully constructed its article in order to just give the one-sided argument that the very nasty, violent protesters were there harassing and threatening and intimidating a senior BBC reporter. So this was the headline, and it's quite a long one. Police probe officers in action when BBC reporter was chased and branded a traitor, scum and a liar while covering anti-lockdown demo, as they quiz man in his 50s over the incident and launch hunt for other protesters. And of course, one of the key pictures they selected was of this particular gentleman. Now, he's wearing clothing which probably gives him an image of being a bit of a biker, and therefore the Daily Mail is able to get the idea across that these are rough, tough, aggressive people. But if you follow the video clip, there's no actual physical violence at all, but the Daily Mail really going for the story. So let's have a look at Resistance GB video clip, which shows that shows the BBC reporter, Mr. Watt, being chased.
BBC! Are you GB News? Resistance GB? Is that GB News? No. Oh, right, you're GB News. How do you guys justify lying by a factor of around 1,000 about the number of protesters? Reporting! Reporting more lies! Using funds that you've already paid for! Please justify how you make a living! Of a brilliant country! Why don't you set up your own news company, like we have, and earn money for people who want to get in there?
All variant of a new strain of a mutation of an old version of a new case. Okay, let's walk. Thanks very much. Sorry to say about report is that several players have contracted the coronavirus.
You completely ignored that this country has a constitution. What about your public service duty? Have you not, how do you sleep at night? With the fact that you're funded by the taxpayer, how do you justify that to yourself? Oh, that was it.
We're today at 6.8 billion people. That's what that's about by doing. Now, we do a really great job
Why have you lied and said that lockdown's illegal? How can it be legal to lock people in their houses without judge, jury and
Yep, so there we have it. Nick Watt, BBC reporter, running back to the safety of Downing Street. In general, the crowd extremely well behaved, but certainly they wanted to challenge him. And in the beginning, very reasonable questions are being put to him. In the latter stages, one or two people getting a bit enthusiastic and in his face. But Alex, there was no real violence there. He wasn't punched, he wasn't hit, he wasn't spat at, something which a crowd out of control might have done. He runs back into Downing Street, and now the police are in trouble for allowing him to walk amongst the crowd. It's interesting.
And it's at the very same Downing Street security gate where my fellow old rugbyan Andrew Mitchell nearly lost his political career over the incident of allegedly calling policemen plebs on that very gate. It's that itself is a kind of microcosm of how things are shifting. A previous generation, several previous generations, would know perfectly well that hardened senior people like Nicholas Watt, the political editor of BBC's Newsnight, no less, the agenda-setting show to end all shows, would be perfectly inured to dealing with the public in an enthusiastic, and yes, I will say, in a traditionally British manner, which involves more than it does on the continent, raising your voice. Possibly having had a drink or two on both sides, the journalists and the crowd, although in this case I think they're all sober. Okay, the chap in the tracksuit, the blue tracksuit top, touches Mr. Watt. I think even in the old days that was out. But a large chunk of this is the frayed sensibilities and unrealistic expectations of today's commentariat, both the journalistic side and the political side of the House. They are, after all, the same blob and feed freely from one to the other. Mr. Watt's supporters or cheerleaders in politics, as you're about to cover, seem to think that he is literally untouchable, perhaps that he should go around with an invisible aura around him. Touch ye not this man, come ye not near him.
Well, couldn't agree more. Let's have a look at what the Daily Mail put forward as the comments. Priti Patel is the first one. I'm afraid I'm going to call her not so pretty on this one. The anti-lockdown protesters are a mob and their actions are appalling. The video of Nick Watt being abused by a mob is appalling and distressing. This behaviour is never acceptable. So she's very, very precious. And then we've got Boris. Well, really, we haven't got Boris because he didn't speak. He got a spokesperson to speak for him. But their comment was, this footage is deeply disturbing. Journalists should never face that kind of behaviour. The right to protest may be fundamental in our democracy, but violence, threats and intimidation is never acceptable. So,
but there was no violence, there were no threats, and intimidation. Well, that's more down to him than anybody else.
I couldn't agree, Mike. So we just add, this is comment from UK Column. The right to protest is fundamental in a democracy, but not when people think they can protest my lockdown and my BBC's COVID fear propaganda. So don't think you're going to challenge Boris Johnson. That's why he's so worried about what's taken place. And then let's bring up Tim Davie, because the Daily Mail also quoted him. The safety of journalists is fundamental to any democracy. They must be able to report unhindered, free from abuse. There's absolutely no justification for any journalist to be treated in this way. We're going to say the reality is, Mr. Davie, that you helped create this situation by using your 5 billion propaganda machine to ramp up fear, stress, and anxiety, because it was the BBC that was promoting all of that applied psychology used in the SAGE group, which knew it was going to have people inflamed, stressed, anxious, and ultimately angry. So Tim Davie helped promote that. And in addition, of course, he ignored hundreds of thousands of people peacefully protesting on the street. So I think we've got to bring Tim Davie's name onto screen, and we've got to say it's his personal actions which are now rebounding on his own BBC journalists. So who's to blame? Well, Tim Davie, partly to blame by his actions in how he has failed to report, or he's misreported what's been happening with COVID. Back to the Daily Mail, of course, they couldn't resist having a go at Piers Corbyn. But this was the picture. So we've got Piers here with a big banner saying, "We demand public TV debate with all sides of science on vax dangers, especially for children." That seems a very reasonable request, but not for the Daily Mail, of course, because their caption for this photo was ahead of the announcement, thousands of anti-lockdown protesters, including arch conspiracy theorist Piers Corbyn, the brother of former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, took to the streets in anger at the decision. So this is more spinning of what took place, but we fully support what Piers is asking for. There should be a fully publicised proper debate on the safety of vaccines and what vaccines are all about. But of course, the BBC isn't going to do that, and the government isn't. Well, the Daily Mail article had to get more in. So here was the picture of Michael Gove with Professor Graham Medley from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and a SAGE member. And he said that Britain could be faced with hundreds of daily COVID deaths despite the delay to the roadmap. Well, Gove was interviewed. Let's have a little look at this video clip and see what Gove had to say.
Can you give us a promise that July the 19th will be the end of it?
Yes.
Well, that's absolutely categoric. I thought we were being led by the data, not the dates.
Yes, and the data shows that we should be in a position to have vaccinated so many people by that date in July that we will be able to lift restrictions. Now, you know, none of us can predict the future with 100% certainty. There could be something bizarre and unprecedented that occurs.
Well, that was a yes or not.
That was a pretty quick about face. So yes, no, yes, no. So what's the truth? Well, we're not going to get truth out of the government. Now, we'd just like to give a special mention to Resistance GB, the team that took the footage of the BBC reporter. They've been doing some really good work. They were kind enough to give us a statement, which we'd like to read out very quickly. From what we could see, this is Resistance GB talking, from what we could see and confer, police weren't worried about Nick Watt, given that anti-lockdown events are in our significant experience of covering them almost entirely peaceful, and as it transpired, he was entirely unharmed. What concerns us more is the utter lies and hypocrisy from government, who have systematically, violently attacked independent journalists, ourselves having been threatened and assaulted by police on Monday, and nearly all of our colleagues having been threatened or violently and unlawfully assaulted many previous times. Yet what we face completely pales in comparison to the false imprisonment and torture of Julian Assange, the most famous journalist in the world, currently held in Belmarsh prison away from his wife and family for telling the truth. Boris Johnson has stated that journalism is the lifeblood of our democracy, yet he and Priti Patel, who also made a statement, are some of the foremost people in the country responsible for violent attacks on journalists and the suppression of free press. Anybody can find footage of Julian Assange being dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy What's happened since is far worse. That is what a journalist being abused. Sorry, that is what a journalist being abused in the UK looks like. Since Monday, the mainstream media has repeatedly requested permission to use our footage to frame a dishonest narrative. We told them all to get stuffed. They've lied about numbers of protesters by a factor of 1,000. They've lied about protesters attacking police who've assaulted them. They've lied about the illegal and unconstitutional lockdowns that our ancestors did not fight through 2 world wars to see imposed. We've turned down thousands of pounds in commission out of principle. Instead, we've offered our footage for free to the UK column, Unity News Network and Russia Today for principal coverage. We've noted what's truly going on in our country. Regardless, many mainstream media have chosen to steal our footage regardless and use it without permission. This only serves to underline the sheer arrogance of the mainstream, that they'll simply take what they want, regardless of whether it belongs to them, in order to feed their narrative. If the mainstream told the truth and did honest journalism, then we wouldn't exist, nor would the growing skepticism of nearly everything they say. We're coming for their jobs, and we'll just keep coming. Alex.
I'm sincerely impressed by Will and Laura running Resistance GB in that way. The irony of the situation is, of course, that Mr. Nicholas Watt only deigned to come over and give them the time of day, which he regretted after 3 seconds, because he thought they were fellow members of the bubble. He thought they were within the charmed circle and that he could draw nigh unto them. He thought they were GB News, launching, at least in one sense, this week under Andrew Neil. And it's been noted in our chat box already that Andrew Neil, the former BBC heavyweight, has already come out swinging in defence of Nicholas Watt and regards himself as similarly outraged and infringed by this non-attack by the invisible mob. So that's an irony of the situation. As soon as he realised it was what he would regard as plebs from the new media, he turned his back on them and said, "Oh, I'm only reporting. I'm not here for anything else." Deeply ironic. Also, the point you made just there, Brian, about the nicking of coverage. This has happened to us as well, and I dare say to Unity News Network and RT, the others who were given the honourable mention by Will and Laura. In our case, at least one instance I can bear in mind, I can recall, is that Chloe Hadjimatheo, of course, of the BBC, nicked some of our interview with Vanessa Beeley in order to put together a hit piece, a hatchet job against her. And Mike, in that case, you might want to talk about it. You challenged her, and she came out with utterly spurious grounds, claiming fair use, which ignored any sense of journalistic usage.
Well, yes, could very strongly make that argument, but we see rules for the mainstream being, well, they view themselves with big legal teams, and they don't need to worry about what they take from smaller organizations.
Yeah. So we just finish off Resistance GB because Will and Laura were kind enough to let UK Column have some of the email exchanges with some of the bigger media companies. So let's have a look at what happened when Aaron Moy from BBC Westminster emailed them. "Hi, I work for BBC Politics and we're interested in potentially using a still or a clip from this footage. Are you able to grant us permission to use, please? Thanks, Aaron Moy, BBC Westminster." And he was given this reply. "Hi, the BBC is funded through fear, violence and intimidation. You consistently lie about the criminal and unconstitutional lockdowns illegally imposed by the government. When hundreds of thousands of people marched on the streets for their freedoms a few weeks ago, you declined to cover it. If you wish to do journalism, then we suggest you do what we do. A, tell the truth, and B, set up your own media organisation that people can either pay for or donate to. We suggest that you highlight the continued torture and false imprisonment of Julian Assange, the most famous journalist in the world, who's currently locked in Belmarsh. To clarify, you do not have permission to use our footage." And let's give you another one. This is from Jenny Hauser from Eurovision. "Hello, I'm contacting you from the European Broadcasting Union about the video of the BBC reporters being chased away at yesterday's protest. Could we get permission to use this video in news reports with a courtesy? Our terms are here." And the reply was, "If you want to do journalism, then we suggest you make a product that people aren't forced to pay for by government and that they choose by their own free will. to buy or donate to as we do. If you follow our work, maybe you'll learn how to do your jobs properly. You people fund yourselves off fear and intimidation. The people hate you, and rightly so. No, you do not have permission to use our video. And the last one here, this is from Luke Dolan. This is from LBC. Good afternoon. I hope you're well. My name is Luke Dolan. I work for the Global Video Desk in London. Would it be okay for LBC to use this video in our website player apps and social channels with full credit to you? Kind regards, Luke Dolan. Well, he got this reply. Afternoon. We and our colleagues have repeatedly been threatened and violently and unlawfully attacked by the Metropolitan Police over the past year, including yesterday, for doing our jobs as journalists. Your failure to mention this, focusing on the plight of privileged BBC liars framed through the narrative of criminal politicians in your article, is exactly why you do not have permission to use our footage. We know how it will be framed. And that's poor old James O'Brien. They put a PS in saying that he's a disgrace. So we're going to say, if you appreciate what this team has been doing, getting out there and taking some really excellent video, perhaps you would be kind enough to support them on their channels and also via that PayPal link, because everything they're doing at the moment, they are funding via their own pocket. So some help would be great.
Okay, if you like what the UK Column does and you would like to support us, then you can go over to ukcolumn.org/community, and there are options to join us there. That would be very much appreciated, but also share our material on the various platforms if you could, please. Now, of course, videos hosted by Rumble now for the UK Column mainly, and thank you very much to Rumble for all their help. But some people saying that they can't watch the videos. Not very many people, but some people saying this. Now, we seem to be getting to the bottom of what the problem is, or what the problem might be. And it looks very much like some of the internet service providers in the UK are in fact blocking access to Rumble videos. And so we have been running some tests. And it seems that if you are using a VPN, a virtual private network of some kind, which bypasses your internet service provider's domain name servers in particular, then there's no problem watching the video. But if, in fact, you're using your connection without a VPN running, then in some cases it seems to be impossible. So it looks like, and it's not confirmed yet, we're still investigating this, but it's beginning to look like the Great Firewall of China is moving to the UK, and already we're seeing some censorship, which is sort of under the surface. Covert. It's not really, but it's absolutely covert. Alex, have you any thoughts?
Only that viewers in Denmark, one of our neighbouring countries, if you count maritime countries as neighbours, can already now only see us on 2 of those 3 platforms, because Denmark has become the first, I suspect not the last, European country to ban access to BitChute at a country IP level.
Okay, so perhaps that's on its way.
Okay. Twitter, of course, censoring if it doesn't like what you say. We got away with this one. We just couldn't resist the 2 images here. This is the red arrows in the sky. Now, remember, these are jets burning fuel, but also using smoke for the entertainment of the G7 group. Let's look at them in a bit more, a bit of a bigger frame here. Here they all are, no social distancing, swigging the alcohol, hugging each other, and watching the airborne pollution. But compare that with the Daily Mail's comments in the article that we've just been talking about, to do with the so-called mobbing of the BBC reporter. In the article, the Daily Mail says at one point the move, they're talking about the delay to the Freedom Day, means that current rules will essentially remain in place until July the 19th, with social distancing in force in bars and restaurants, and the edict to work from home where possible staying. So the great and the good, they're clearly breaching all of the laws. The Daily Mail's quite happy with that, but it's going to turn on anybody who demonstrates. And with emails into the UK column, this was another interesting one. So a lady has said to us that she's looking at an advert for COVID marshals. So certainly if you're recruiting COVID marshals, Mike, it doesn't seem as though the lid is going to come off lockdown anytime soon. And this is Indeed, which is carrying the job advert, but they're only paying a measly 10 to £11.21 an hour. So presumably some limitations on those people.
Yes. Okay, let's move on to this. This is from the BBC this morning. Going back a little bit of time. This is September 2020. The Tory MP Chloe Smith rejects husband's COVID mental illness claim. Now, her husband had made a statement saying that he thought that COVID-19 would turn out to be the biggest mental illness ever because he was effectively saying it was fake. Now, she had to set a step aside from that statement. But nonetheless, who is Chloe Smith? Well, of course, she's a member of Parliament, but she is also the Minister for the Constitution. And she was speaking at Policy Exchange yesterday, all about the government's plans to defend democracy in the UK. So everybody should be very happy that the British government is defending democracy. So let's look at how they're doing that. But she began her speech by saying, for an elected politician, the second American president, John Adams, was strikingly pessimistic about democracy. Remember, it never lasts long, he once warned, but it soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. She goes on to say, for an elected politician, there never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide, is what he went on to say. That's how she quotes him. And she said, talking about people that are running so-called dictatorships around the world, really Russia and China is what she's talking about here. Those adversaries favor control, corruption, and conformity, whereas she and her government fights for freedom, responsibility, enterprise, and tolerance. So everybody should be feeling very good about that. She went on to talk then about the new elections bill, about plans to introduce photo identification in polling stations, about the elections bill, which is going to work to protect everyone against political intimidation, that they're going to modernize existing counter-espionage laws to reflect the modern threat and legislative standards. These proposals, she said, will create new offences, tools and powers to detect, deter and disrupt hostile activity targeting the UK. They're going to seek views on Official Secrets Act reforms, so they're going to shut down any whistleblowing. They're going to push forward their groundbreaking online safety legislation. And the UK is doing this in two ways, she said. First, through a cross-government counter-disinformation unit to lead the fight against online misinformation and disinformation. And secondly, through legislation. So all this legislation is coming through. She didn't mention the crime and policing bill, which of course she should have. But all this legislation is all about defending democracy. So, of course, on Monday evening, we had Boris Johnson's announcement about the extension to lockdown for another 4 weeks. Well, that was a live stream that was pushed out, but there was no statement made to Parliament. And the Speaker was pretty upset about this, Lindsay Hoyle. He was pretty upset about this, and this is what he had to say.
First of all, can I say I'm grateful to both gentlemen for giving notice of the point of order. I've repeatedly made it clear how important it is that announcements should be made in this chamber first. As you are both aware, the Secretary of State will be making a statement at 8:30 on COVID. That will give members of the House an opportunity to question him on the government's policy. However, it is not what I would have expected. A statement to the House before announcement to the press is not acceptable. The government determines when ministers make statements, but in doing so, they must show respect to this House. Can I just say, we weren't going to get a statement until I got involved with Downing Street. The fact is, this has been forced to actually get a statement today. It was going to be left to tomorrow, which would have been totally unacceptable. I was told no decisions have been taken. That's why I'm more shocked to know there is an embargoed list of what's going to happen to this country without this House knowing. I was told no decisions have been taken, that no decisions will be taken until the Cabinet meets. The fact is, I am being misled, this House is being misled, it is not acceptable, and I would welcome them coming here before they make the press statement, as the press have already got an embargo. And I'm sure now that the Whip is texting the Chief Whip to let him know exactly what's being said, because it's disappointing to all of us. I'm now suspending the House.
So what basically happened was that Boris had scheduled a live stream to make the announcement. A press release had gone out to the press, which was embargoed until that live stream had taken place. Parliament hadn't been given any kind of briefing, and so Lindsay Hoyle stepped in and forced Matt Hancock to go in and make a statement to Parliament. But Alex, this is an incredible situation. I mean, we've seen it building over a period of time here, and really the John Adams quote at the very beginning of Chloe's speech is absolutely prescient here, because we have a Parliament that thinks that it ought to be God. We have a government which is behaving like it is God, and neither of them is actually correct, because both their attitudes are way over the top. So, democracy in the UK has ceased to exist effectively because we have a government which is behaving like it is
a dictatorship.
Well, it is a dictatorship, and Parliament doesn't know actually what its position is relevant to that dictatorship. So, how do we move forward from this point?
By the outlawing of political parties, for which no common law country was ever set up, and by a hazard which the US founding fathers and the equivalent statesmen of that era in Britain and Ireland were very keen to point out. That the returning of members to Parliament by free and fair elections, as enunciated in the Bill of Rights 1688 and the Claim of Right in Scotland, is absolutely not negotiable. It's not up for grabs. And I recently heard even continental commentators, Rainer Füllmich and his German associates, pointing out, because some of them are forming another German party, which is the best they can hope to do in their system at present. You can't vote for independence there. They are starting to realize, even in the continental system that has been blind to this, that a party, by definition, is something that interposes, comes between the voter and his government. And the whole point of a representative in Parliament is that he is you in Parliament saying, we will not have this. This is the key, the kernel of what we have been teasing out in A Dissident's Guide to the Constitution. Go to ukcolumn.org and from the top menu, find under the topics menu, the Constitution button, and go through that series. It would be remiss of me also not to point out that the final stage of laws that are passed, when they get through these awful rounds of spin doctors that Mr. Hoyle has got so enraged about now, the final hurdle is that the sovereign, embodying our sovereignty under law, is meant to sign assent, a royal assent. And she hasn't done so, thanks to one of our viewers who's done research with the House of Lords about this. In fact, none of our predecessors have since 1854. Since the early Victorian era, a committee of lords, which now is merging with that spin doctor blob as far as we can see, verbally claims that the Queen has assented. Royal signatures are not actually appended. So the tripartite system of government fell even at that age, which is about the same time that whipped parties came into the lead. So the long and the short of it is we must have independent candidates in Parliament. Otherwise, we just are on a hiding to nothing again. This vicious cycle will repeat itself, as Mr. Adams predicted.
Yes, indeed.
I'll just add one comment to that. People are often asked who is running the show. Well, clearly it isn't Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson is in the position that he's in due to the support given to the Conservative Party. So follow the money trail. Who was paid for the Conservative Party? Who was paid for Boris Johnson's leadership? It comes down to this money trail, and this is the same for all of the parties.
Okay, Alex. Now this is from the Crime Bodge website, YouTube channel. Sorry, and it was published at the end of May. But the title is "Man Gets 5 Years for Having three lawful books and the wrong views."
We can see something of the decay in the legal system here, mirroring what you said about Parliament. Crime Bodge is a YouTube channel well worth subscribing to, and two of these cases have been covered in rapid succession by it, which is why I've put them up now. They both involve a new generation of Crown prosecutors, as they are in England and Wales. The Crown Office in Scotland is the equivalent that we've covered more of the nefarious business of, but the CPS in England and Wales is just as bad by this stage. They and a new generation of judges who became Queen's Counsel in the post-Blair reforms. They had to jump through a hoop of quangos to tick boxes to get into to be a judge. Now, this new generation is reinterpreting some of the legislation just before the turn of the millennium, but particularly those regarding malicious communications and misuse of computers. And they're starting at the fringes. If they think they can get away with plastering someone as a neo-Nazi, they're going to start using this legislation, which was basically came through in the 80s and 90s in a fit of horror that technology was allowing people to become stalkers and cheerleaders for terrorists, which something must be done, and unspecified. So a vague legislation went in. The second generation since then has got such empty minds or such repurposed minds, they are starting to use the provisions of this 20 to 30-year-old legislation in ways that we hadn't envisaged. But let's have a look at the relevant section of law that's at issue here. It's even from before 9/11. It's the Prevention of Terrorism Act 2000. If you've been through a British airport or port, you will know that this is displayed. A different section of this law is what's displayed, saying if you don't tell the police at this desk everything they want to know for hours, including intimate details, they will lock you up as a terrorist. And if you don't give them the password to your devices, you'll be a convicted terrorist. Well, you might like to read the whole of Article Section 58. It's the very vagueness of it which is so concerning here. This has got a man sent to jail for 5 years now, as we're about to see, for owning 3 downloads, legal downloads, by the way.
Well, I'm not going to read it all, Alex, because we are heading out of time. People can read that for themselves, but it does begin: a person commits an offence if he collects or makes a record of information of a kind likely to be useful to a person committing or preparing an act of terrorism, if he possesses a document or record containing information of that kind, or if the person views or otherwise accesses by means of the internet a document or record containing information of that kind, and so on. But this is typical of Parliament, of legislative language, that it leaves many diverse ways to expand the scope.
It's one of these clauses of recent legislation that reverses the burden of proof and doesn't have a reasonable defence clause in it, which for anyone, even amateur involved in the law, will know is a no-no. It's not how the common law works. It's not even how the better civil law jurisdictions work these days. But let's look at the convicting judge in this case, Peter Lodder QC, a resident judge at Kingston upon Thames Crown Court. In sentencing the man involved, he said the following, addressing Nicholas Brock, the defendant, in sentencing remarks. He said, "It is clear from the material found on your computer and your hard drive that you are a right-wing extremist." Well, one of the things that sentence indicates to us is that it is a jailable offence to be a right-wing extremist. I'm not sure when that went through Parliament, or has it just gone through the BBC? And he continued to say, "Methinks the judge doth protest too much here. I do not sentence you for your political views, but the extremity of those views informs," which is posh language for dictates, "the assessment of dangerousness." So a judge can't send a man to prison for having the wrong views, but he can send him to prison for appearing dangerous. Now, Mr. Warner, who is the legal advisor and commentator running the Crime Bodge channel, has had this to say in the video which I put up on screen. He says the most repulsive of all this is book burning by backdoor political censorship. But, and this is a departure from Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, Mr. Warner says rather than burn the book, they choose to burn the reader instead, they here being the new generation of Crown prosecutors. Section 58 of the Prevention of Terrorism Act 2000 does not require reasonable suspicion. Even people who have a run-in with traffic police will know that reasonable suspicion is a cornerstone of the common law in police powers terms. They don't require reasonable suspicion that an article, so in this case a download, has a purpose connected to terrorist activity. It's only likely to be useful to bad people. Right? And he continues, Rob Warner continues, the burden of proof also falls upon the defendant here to show that they had a reasonable excuse for having this article, in this case download, in their possession. So this is the law turned on its head, but it's been the case for 21 years now, a generation. Nobody seems to have bothered to protest about it much. And Mr. Warner concludes that Section 58 of this Act 2000 is so widely drawn, it enables the police, and they have started doing it now, that's the new development, to arrest anyone who purchases a particular book or download. So just as it's a kind of secondary matter to inform Parliament of how long we're going to be locked up, likewise it's a secondary matter to put before MPs a draft and say, would you mind awfully putting this into law so we can lock up the dissidents? Because that can all be short-circuited through the right kind of prosecutor and judge and cowed jury. Because, of course, this will have gone through a jury who will have sat there like sheep, if we don't get into trouble for putting it that way, and will have been directed by the judge, as Brian, you've seen happen personally in courtrooms, will have been directed, this is a bad man, you must convict him. Now, the other case which has been covered at the same time by Crimebodge is the video that got this man jailed for 18 months. This is a man who, at the time of the ostensible offence, was just 22 in Yorkshire, Louis Duxbury. There had been a terrorist attack, real or otherwise, or whatever you want to call it. He had said he was outraged by it in a video, and the reason the cassette is the thumbnail icon for that video is that they still use the cassettes for this purpose, the police interview tapes. And the thing that I think people ought to bear in mind when they go and listen to that commentary is that the bogeyman that was put up in this case was the Muslims will be terribly offended. Now, right through the probation service and the prison service and whatnot, Mr. Duxbury was repeatedly intimidated by British officials, white British officials, by being threatened with being pummeled by Muslims or being put in front of Muslims and called a bad, nasty man. And in one case described there by Crimebodge, he was put in a small room with an imam, I think one imam known to the prison and probation service, and told, well, go and explain yourself to the imam. And Mr. Duxbury said, hello, Mr. Imam, let me civilly explain to you what I did in this video. The imam said, I see. Thank you for telling me. At which point the probation officer yelled, no, don't talk at the imam, listen to him, get yourself re-educated. And this continues through the probation service where, of course, he's not allowed to record. And he's told, recognize that your skin color is part of the problem. You have white privilege. So the problem is not just wretched law, it's that we're the second generation into having tolerated wretched law. And now a much worse caliber of mind-controlled and repurposed people start applying it against political enemies, starting at the margins. And they've actually gone against Mr. Piers Corbyn as one of the first, because he mentioned Holocaust in the wrong context. And this was turned around by the CPS and police to something disgusting and malicious in communications. So, as John Adams said again, it's quite prescient of the Minister for the Constitution to have said it. If you let these things slide, they will continue to slide. A democracy is not a stable state.
That's absolutely right. And but Alex, I would say that there is quite a body of evidence to suggest that this concept of right-wing extremism is something which is being it's a construct which is being built by the police and by the security services and by the government at the moment. It's not really there, and not to any significant degree anyway. But it's being then used to justify the likes of the online safety bill, and to shut down any kind of free speech. And then, of course, people are being labelled and categorised and so on. So you're saying they're starting at the fringes, but actually, are they? Because the people involved in this, they maybe weren't reading mainstream material, but it wasn't massively right-wing extremist material either. Because as you said at the beginning, this was legal material that they had.
Yes, and another of the cases where malicious communications have been brought in recently, again in Yorkshire, which seems to be suffering greatly from this, the Crown Prosecution Service and the police colluded to trawl all those who had been leafleted by a party and a movement called Patriotic Alternative. Some of our viewers are sympathetic and others are not to them. We have to leave that aside and talk about the issues. The leafleting concern, which got a young man at least threatened with jail time, was simply demographics. And this is, I think, quite comparable to how UK Column is now being hounded for statistics. If it's the wrong kind of statistics, and likewise with the downloads that the defendant in Kingston had and that's now gone down for 5 years for, it's the wrong kind of legal material. The plebs are not meant to have this stuff. And all this is being done without any real provisions in primary legislation. It's being left, it's MPs' fault, or it's ultimately our fault for voting for parties. But once we return those controlled MPs, they vote through provisions repugnant to the common law, which allow a judge and a prosecutor to say, this is a really bad man, trust me, with no details forthcoming.
Yes. Okay, well, look, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to cover this before we go, because this is the Committee on Climate Change. Now, we're going back to 2019 here, and this report is called Reducing UK Emissions, the 2019 Progress Report to Parliament. And I wanted to highlight a particular section out of this, because they said that the government should put people at the heart of policy design. Over half the emissions cuts to reach net zero emissions require people to do things differently. And this was the key focus of this report. They were saying in July 2019 that unless people start to do things differently, the government was not going to meet its net zero targets. That was in the second half of 2019. 6 months later, as we've mentioned before, people were forced to start doing things differently because of lockdown policy. Well, a year later, then they produced, I should just mention, of course, in that report, it was full of some fantastic projections of UK climate hazards and so on. Well, we'll see more of that in a second. A year later, we have another report, Progress Report to Parliament in June 2020, reducing UK emissions. It's the same report 1 year on. And they say in April 2020, we wrote to the Prime Minister and the First Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, setting out 6 principles for a resilient recovery from COVID-19, using climate investments, leading a shift towards positive long-term behaviours. And in both those papers then, behaviour was a key part of the narrative. And indeed, they had from Warwick University a key behavioural scientist who I believe the same Warwick University has been putting behavioural information into SAGE and other groups. And then this here's an example recommendation, this time for the Department of Transport. And the recommendation was that people should, or that the government should invest in walking and cycling infrastructure and strengthen other schemes to support active travel modes, invest in public transport and other measures to reduce car travel demand, e.g. car sharing, mobility as a service, improve infrastructure connectivity to lock in positive behaviours that reduce travel demand, e.g. home working. And we have increasingly seen that over the last 12 months. Well, they've got a new report out today. It's called their Independent Assessment of Climate Risk. Let's just get a quote out of this. Climate change has arrived. The world is now experiencing the dangerous impacts of a rapidly heating climate. Now, I'm not sure which climate they're talking about. I suspect it's more the political climate than anything else. But anyway, they claim that the climate is rapidly heating and further warming is inevitable, even on its most ambitious pathways for the reduction of global greenhouse emissions. The focus of this report is risk. But it is, and all the reports, 100% based on computer models, exactly the same type of computer models that we've seen driving the COVID narrative over the last 14 months. And how did this end up? Well, it resulted in a BBC report entitled UK Warned It's Unprepared for Climate Chaos. And as you read down this, you find very much the same type of psychological operation on the issue of climate to instill fear in the population, that immediate action is required, as we've seen with COVID. And I'm going to just say once again, Brian, that there is, without question in my mind, a link between the policy directions that are being imposed for climate change and COVID-19. We've seen exactly the same types of tactics being used and clearly the same strategy being used as well.
Without any doubt, without any doubt.
Alex.
On that score, Laura Dodsworth, in her book, A State of Fear, records her surprise that when she was talking to one of the several SPIB members who deigned to speak to her, they made a mental segue from COVID-19 to, look, climate change is much the same. And she spends a paragraph saying, what on earth triggered that mental equivalence in the mind of the SPIB member?
Because I think that equivalence is there all the time.
Reframing is the answer.
Okay, we better leave it there.
I think we probably should. What can we say? Really serious things unfolding now, but at least we can see it. If it takes the Speaker to say that now the parliamentary system is effectively finished, we just have Boris Johnson giving edicts to the country and the police are enforcing those, we know what we're dealing with. In the same way, if we can see the G7 people looking at the sky and those amazing chemical trails from the red arrows, obviously one set of rules for the elite and another for us. What can we do? Keep speaking out, keep lifting the stones and exposing what's happening. And can we say more people to be out on the streets, filming, recording, speaking, spreading the word? Resistance GB, one of those teams. We need many, many more people doing this right across the country. We'll leave it there.
Yeah, we'll be back in a few minutes on the UK Column live stream with some extra, and otherwise we'll see you on 1 p.m. as usual on Friday.
Okay, thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.